And if you are a member of Los Angeles, I can't even speak, Los Angeles Birders, thank you very much. We appreciate and really kind of need your support in our efforts to create Los Angeles Birders, an organization for the 21st century that's more geared towards birders. And it's, I think, a really successful model so far. We seem to have a lot of support, but we can always use your support. Our if Your membership helps support live recorded webinars like this one, and it'll go up on our website in the next couple of days when you can enjoy it over and over again. We have local field ornithology events such as our recent Swainson's hawk count, and we have community science projects, etc., etc. So please, please come and support us. Next. Oh, there you go. And with that, I'd like to introduce Naresh Satyan, who will introduce our speaker for tonight. Naresh?
Thanks, Ron. We're very pleased to have Ted Keyel with us tonight to talk about identifying raptors. Ted grew up birding along the Racine Lakeshore in Wisconsin, and he's now an avian ecologist working as an environmental consultant. Ted has always loved raptors and bird migration, and especially watching large numbers of birds in migration. He also really enjoys photographing birds and birds in flight. So participating in Raptor Watches has been a great opportunity to combine those two passions. Ted has been fortunate enough to count at many hawkwatch locations worldwide, looking at huge numbers of raptors in flight. He has counted at the Florida Keys Hawkwatch, looking at thousands of peregrine falcons. He has also counted raptors at Veracruz in Mexico, which is home to one of the greatest raptor migration spectacles in the world. Ted's best count day in Veracruz was in the fall of 2016, when he recorded over 200,000 raptors and vultures in one single day. Almost 4 million raptors and vultures were counted there throughout that fall. During spring migration, Ted has also helped count around 500,000 old world raptors in Eilat in Israel, at a migration site that holds the record for the largest spring migration of raptors. We look forward to Ted sharing some of that expertise with us tonight. Over to you, Ted.
Okay, thank you very much. Is that good?
That looks great.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Naresh. I appreciate the introduction. Yeah, so the purpose of this talk is to identify raptors, particularly in flight, and the general focus will be starting with close, seeing them nice and neat, and then getting farther away into maybe not quite to specs, but more along those lines. As a just kind of general overview, I'll start with what is a raptor, both from a more technical side and then more colloquially, and go over some general identification traits. And then I'll get into more details on identifying groups of raptors. This talk is not designed to be a species level talk, though there will be a little bit of overlap, especially with things like Osprey and Harrier and the like. So to start with, I figured it'd be good to say, what is a raptor? And as it turns out, there's 3 real characteristics that define a raptor. One is binocular vision. So you have eyes set forward in the head with very good vision. Sharp, piercing talons for catching prey, and then a hooked bill for tearing into the prey. More generally, raptor encompasses a variety of birds of prey over multiple families, even more genera, such as condors, vultures, eagles, kites, harriers, hawks such as accipiters and buteos, falcons, and owls. Also, throughout this talk, I'll be using a variety of images. So while it'll mostly be LA focused, some of the images won't necessarily be from the LA area, but they'll still convey the points that I'm trying to get across. That'll be similar for the same sorts of birds you'd have. So if you're wondering, you look at a bird and you're like, well, that looks a little different, that looks a little odd, it's not something I'm used to, it might very well not be. So typically in field guides, you'll get a situation where you have a photo on the left, where it's a pretty close shot of a bird that's in pretty good light. It's a fairly crisp photo. More often than not, though, when you're in the field, that's not really how you see birds. They tend to be much farther away. The lighting maybe is okay, but at distance, it still changes a lot of what the individual plumage details are. And it can, in some instances, you just get into specks. Oh, is that dust, or are those actually all individual birds? If we zoom in and we look, okay, we can see the specks a little bit better. And as a quick terminology side note, in the US, when you have a group of birds swirling up on warm air currents, it's typically called a kettle. Some places it's also referred to as a vortex. But how do we identify birds? So sometimes when we have multiple birds together, we can start comparing one to another. So we look at the bird in the upper right, we can see that it appears larger than the other two. It has some dark carpal patches right in the wrists. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it has dark carpal patches in the wrist, has fairly long wings, fairly wide wings, long
Yeah, we
tail.
are not seeing your mouse, by the way.
Okay, thank you. I won't use it then as a reference. And then if you just look at plumage, all three of these birds look quite a bit different, but structurally, you'll note that the two on the left actually look very, very similar. So it turns out it's because they're the same species. It's just an adult and a young bird. But plumage varies, and shape and structure do, but not usually to the same extent that plumage can. So as a result, you'll have a lot of field guides that will show silhouettes, because silhouettes can be a good learning tool to focus on more of these shape and structure characteristics. You don't really get flight style, but short of videos and just watching birds in person, it's really hard to convey flight style in any sort of non-moving format. So what happens when you don't have anything else? You just have a single bird, it's flying over, and where do you even begin? I found when I was hawk counting that I typically come across three types of people. I would come across those who already had a pretty good sense and knowledge of what they were doing. Those who didn't, but also didn't really want to do any work. They just wanted me to be their eyes. So they'd want me to look at every single bird that they were looking at, not realizing that I had to be scanning the whole sky. And then the third set were people who were new, but didn't know where to begin and didn't really have a good sense of how to start. And I found that the Socratic method really worked fantastically for working with the latter two groups, because those who didn't really want to do work, if I asked, oh, what do you see on it, then now I'm making them do work, they would bother me more. And those who actually wanted to learn, and it's a very overwhelming question to start, because what do you even focus on? There's so much information in terms of shape and structure and plumage. And do you look at what characteristics are useful, what characteristics aren't? There's a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge that's required to get to that point. But then I would start to work them through, and it was fantastic because then they were actually learning, and they could start identifying things much more consistently. So some traits that are really useful are, how long are the wings? It's like, okay, well, what does wing length mean relative to what? Well, let's say wing length relative to the body. Are the wings appear longer than the body, and by twice as much, half as much? How much longer do the wings appear? What about the tail? Is the tail long? Is it short? Are the wings wide? Are they narrow? If we put all of that together in this little chart here, these are all the same exact lines, just shifted over. And we can see that this bird, the wings are quite a bit longer than the body. The tail's about uneven with the body, and the width is maybe like 3/4 of the body. So similarly, we can shift over to something else and then look at those same sorts of things. Are they long? Are they wide? So in this bird, the wings are very, very long. It's more than twice the length of the body. The tail's also fairly long. The wings are very, very wide. In addition, the way that the birds hold themselves are also is very important to look at. You'll frequently hear the term dihedral with regards to raptor identification. And the dihedral is effectively just holding their wings in a V. And you can have variations of this of modified dihedral or slight dihedral. So maybe instead of holding the wings in a really tight V, it's they started out and then kind of droop down. But if I use the word dihedral or you hear someone else, it's referring to this V shape. So for a little more of a real world view of dihedral on birds coming towards us, we have a couple vultures and a Swainson's hawk. The Swainson's hawk has a modified dihedral. You can see the wings droop a little more relative to the vultures, but all of them have the wings that start up in kind of this V shape. You have to be really careful though, especially with when you're looking at photos and single photos. And this also goes across more than just identifying raptors, but single photos can be really, really misleading, even if there's no malicious intent on the part of the photographer, because you're stealing you're stealing a single moment in time. So here we have the vulture, which has a very pronounced dihedral, and the shape of this eagle, which makes it look like a dihedral. However, this eagle is in mid-flap. And so the photo was taken right as the bird was actively flapping. It just happens to be on a downstroke at the moment. And you can see a hint of that with the bird's right wing, so on our left, where there's some flex in those outer primaries. But sometimes it's not even, you don't even have anything quite that obvious. But in general, anytime you're looking at photos, it's good to be mindful of, is the angle of the bird in the photo lengthening or shortening different characteristics of the bird? Is there something about that one particular photo that's not providing a representative look at a single bird? So I always recommend, if possible, if someone posts a photo of something, to always ask if they have more than one photo, and if they have some semblance of an idea of what it is. It can go a long way in trying to tease out what individual bird is from just from a photo. So in addition to wing length and structure, there's some other really useful, wing length and width. There's some other really useful structure characteristics that can be beneficial for identifying raptors. And one of which is what the end of the wings look like. So on the falcon, on the kestrel on the upper left, the wings are fairly pointed, whereas on the sharpshin in the lower left, they have more of a rounded look. Also, the number of individual primaries. So if you look at, say, the bald eagle in the center, where you can see on that right wing has all of those feathers so very cleanly and distinctly marked. And there's a lot of different names and terms that are used for that: emarginated primaries, slotted primaries, fingered primaries, and probably some others that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head. I will probably use a combination. Mostly I switch between emarginated and slotted. But looking at those in different groups and different species have different numbers of emarginated primaries. And so something with, say, that, we turn to that kestrel, on falcons, you don't really get a lot of emargination. You can kind of pull out a few, but it's really just this very pointed wing look. Whereas on, say, the northern harrier in the upper right, you can see that it has 5. The red shoulder in the lower right also has 5. Bald eagles and sharpshins have 6. As an interesting note, in the US, there's only 3 regularly occurring species of buteos that have 4 emarginated primaries. All other species have 5. So Swainson's hawk on the lower left, broad-winged hawk in the middle, and then white-tailed hawk on the lower right. are the only 3 species of Buteos in the US that have 4 emarginated primaries. However, you have to be a little careful. So if we look at the bird on the left and we start on the left side, so the bird's right wing, we can see that there's 5 slotted primaries, 5 marginated primaries. However, on the other wing, there's only 4, and it's inverse for the other bird. And so be mindful of molt or just general feather loss can influence the number of fingered primaries, or what appears to be kind of distinct separate primaries. A couple other things to be cautious about are that sometimes, depending on the species, young birds and adult birds can look different. So to me, young broadwings tend to have a little sleeker, narrower look. They generally appear to be a little bit longer tailed, or at least have that appearance. And then in eagles, say bald eagles, it's the opposite, where the young birds actually have longer and wider feathers. And bald eagles don't molt all of their flight feathers all at once. And so you can get into a situation like with the bird on the right, where you can see distinct old feathers and new feathers, where the young feathers are those longer, wider feathers, and then the replaced feathers are the newer feathers. For more information on molt, please watch Peter Pyle's amazing talk on molt for this channel. A few other things that can influence shape and flight style and appearance are something like a full crop. So if a raptor is eaten, it has this area where it can store food. This can make things look like they have a much larger head than what they actually have, or some sort of excessive wear and tear, like the sharpshin is missing a tail, and so it'll fly differently as a result of not having its tail. One final point on kind of angles that I want to make is that anything that's going away is always going to have a pointed winged look. And this tends to throw a lot of people off, where they'll see something and they'll start to get their camera up. And by the time they finally get the camera up and it's going away, they'll look at the photos and, oh, it has a pointed wing. So maybe it's one of these things that has a pointed wing, whereas just anything that's going away has pointed wings, whether they normally have pointed wings or not. I kind of like the sharpshin photo in the bottom right for an example of that, whereas the bird's left wing is fairly rounded, whereas the right wing looks pointed. And that's a combination of the bird going away and just the one particular angle of this one photo. One other tangent that I do want to make a quick segue on, and I realize you're probably mostly used to Andy's amazing artwork, and if you haven't already gotten his Flycatcher book, please go get Flycatchers in North America. It's amazing. And I'm sorry, I've now ruined your opinion of what good art is across the board, but I figured it was a risk to take. Of course, I'm kidding. I know that I'm awful. But often at migration sites, there'll be horizontal call out points where you can call out, oh, such and such is over this spot. And so people can get on them a lot better. So for example, I counted at Montclair in New Jersey for a spring and a fall, and I might call out a bald eagle over the Empire State Building, because invariably it was always a bald eagle that was over the Empire State Building. And it was a really quick and really easy way to get people on the bird. Whereas with vertical callouts, it's a lot more challenging. Some people may try to do a vertical clock, but I've always found that where the center of that clock is really influences the non-12,639 points. And I've never found that it works, whereas I like to divide the sky into quarters, and it's, this is a very rough generalization. It's not a hard and fast of, oh, this bird is exactly 26 degrees, therefore it must be in low B. It's just a general pushing off point of high A, low B is roughly the same area, and it's substantially different than if you're looking at, say, mid C. So I like to split the sky into quadrants of A, B, C, and then you can do D, but I typically just do overhead. and then also further subdivide those into low, mid, and high. And I find that that tends to be a really useful way to get people on things on a vertical level. So now into condors and vultures. So this will be the start of kind of our group talk. And condors are just massive. They're really, it's hard to confuse condors for much of anything. Anytime you have a bird that makes a raven look like a redwing, it's pretty impressive. So huge bird with really, really long wings. They have 7 marginated primaries, very obvious white underneath. They're pretty much all numbered. They have large heads, but no feathers on the head. And yeah, very, very long wings, very wide wings. They fly in a very pronounced dihedral. We have 2 species of vultures in the US. We have black and turkey vulture. They also have very, very long wings, very wide wings, featherless heads, and fairly wide tails. Both species have 6 marginated primaries. They tend to be very dark throughout, although depending on the light, with blacks you can get the shine in those outer primaries, and turkeys just kind of along the flight feathers. But at distance, they tend to appear very dark. And yes, there is at least one black vulture in this photo. Feel free to look for it. But you'll see even at distance, the heads very quickly disappear, but they're large birds with long wings, wide wings, pretty obvious tail. Similarly for condors, they're just always massive, and even the distances that white stands out. As I said, they're pretty hard to confuse for much of anything else. When I was 14, I went to the Grand Canyon, and I'd never seen condors before. And I went up to the park ranger, and she said, "Excuse me, sir, but could you please tell me where I could find California condors?" He kind of looks up and points and goes, "Oh yeah, those are them right up there." I said, "But there's 32 of them, and they're all dark, and they're all turkey vultures." "No, no, 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 those are the condors." And he was convinced that that's what they were, but he wasn't going to have some 14-year-old kid tell him otherwise. But beyond that, they tend to be pretty hard to mistake for much of anything else. So segueing into eagles, which are similar to vultures in a number of ways. They tend to be very dark. They tend to also have very long wings, very wide wings, usually with 6 marginated primaries for golden bald eagle. And depending on the age, they can have various amounts of white. Bald eagles have even larger heads than golden, and having the feathered heads give them a much more obvious head look as opposed to vultures, where vultures often look headless at distances, and goldens to some extent can, but you still have more of a head than you typically would see on vulture. And some eagles get very, very wide, very flat winged, kind of like a piece of wood with sticks on either side, or I think of trunnions on a cannon, but that might be just me. Eagles can be difficult to separate from vultures, especially golden eagle, and especially at distance. One thing that helps with turkey vulture versus golden eagle is that turkey vultures are just so buoyant that they're always rocking, whereas golden eagles tend to fly very, very straight. Interesting side note, if you have turkey vultures and golden eagles in the same area, the turkey vultures will always be above the golden eagles. They don't take that risk. Not that I've ever seen a golden eagle go after a turkey vulture, but I think they just got to the point where they know it's not worth it. Another very large bird is osprey, also fairly difficult to confuse with much else except maybe gulls. They have very, very long wings, dark carpal bars, so right in the wrists, kind of the bends in the wings. The flight feathers tend to be dark, checkerboarded, but at distance that usually ends up being a dark appearance versus a light appearance. Very, very long wings. They tend to be fairly rounded. and often fly in kind of an M shape, also very reminiscent of gulls. Ospreys are awesome for a lot of reasons, one of which is they'll often fly with fish. Even on migration, you'll see an osprey just migrating by with a fish, and they made sure to orient it so it's the most aerodynamic and reduces air resistance, so that it's head on. And also, I believe they're found on every continent except for Antarctica, which to my knowledge is also only shared by peregrine falcon. At distance, they're still very long-winged. You can see that kind of classic M shape in this photo, kind of pale whitish body shifting into dark between the combination of the wings themselves and just the angle of the photos. Here's one in comparison with a gull. So a little bit wider wings than a gull, typically a little more rounded. They'll be larger than the gulls as well. And again, even at kind of speck level distances, very, very long wings, usually with a pretty pronounced wrist if they're just in an open glide. Medium with tail, it's also usually fairly noticeable. Switching into kites. Kites in the area tend to have long wings with a curve to them at times. They're very, very pointed wings, tend to be kind of medium length tails that are very, very squared off. As a note about kites, the word kite is almost as bad as the word hawk in terms of just kind of how much it encompasses. To my knowledge, it's about 14 genera worldwide, depending on what taxonomy you're using. And so to try to make generalizations across all kites is very, very difficult, from things like old world kites like the black kite on the left versus some of the other new world kites like the snail kite in the middle or hook-billed on the right. It's the focus of this talk for kites is going to be on things that are a little more LA and southern US oriented, like white-tailed and Mississippi. Because thankfully white-tailed and Mississippi share a number of similar structural similarities. It's a little redundant. So again, very long wings. While they technically have 4 marginated primaries, it's not as useful as knowing that 10th primary, that outermost primary, is much shorter than all of the rest. So that helps to give kites this much more pointed look. The tail corners tend to be very, very sharp as well. It's not really a rounded tail, it's very rectangular. And young birds vary chromatically from adults, but structurally they're still quite similar. Again, very long wings, kind of medium to short tails. As you start losing some feathers, like that young bird in the upper right has kind of wonky things going on with its wings. So you start to get a little bit, you get a little less of a pointed look. But even at distance, they still have quite pointed wings. The tails often will look pinched in. They're gliding. They'll frequently glide with their tails fanned, and so it looks like where the tail meets the body has kind of this pinched look. And even at distance, this still very, very pointed wings, kind of medium to short tail. They can be very difficult to separate from falcons. Kites tend to be a little less direct. That's not super helpful if you're unfamiliar, but they tend to be a little more buoyant and not quite as just kind of power and motion. White-tail kite in particular tends to have a dihedral. And speaking of things with dihedrals, we'll switch into harriers. I did want to start with actually probably my least favorite identification marker on Harrier that there is, which is that white rump. Not because it's inaccurate, but just because it tends to be the only identification mark that a lot of people know for Harriers. And so when you have a Harrier that's directly above you and you're trying to look for that white rump, you're not gonna see it. And then that identification becomes a lot more difficult. As a further complication to that matter, Sometimes some accipiters, when they're doing their display flights, their undertail coverts will be really fluffed out, and in some cases they'll even sometimes interlock to give a white rump appearance. This photo isn't quite that extreme, but it's reasonably close. And I've seen people call coops and coops and other accipiters, well, coops and sharpies, I guess, harriers, just because they see the white rump and that's the only field mark that gets associated with harriers, which is a shame because there's a lot of they're really distinctive group of birds. They have very, very long wings. They have very, very long tails. The wings are kind of medium to narrow. The tail is also quite the same. They're they're dichromatic, so the adult males look different from the young males and females, both adult and young females. They also fly with a very pronounced dihedral. So if you're just looking at color alone, this bird looks very different from the bird before. But when you're looking at more of those shape and structure differences, you can see the very, very long wings are often pushed slightly forward and has a very, very long tail. And even at distance, those are still the same sorts of things that you're looking at, because I mean, there's no color to be had whatsoever on this bird, but we can make out long wings, long tail, and it's at distance they can be a little difficult to separate from other species with very pronounced dihedral, especially turkey vulture, but they tend to be thinner winged and more svelte like, and as with golden eagle versus turkey vulture, the harriers aren't going to be rocking. Accipiters also have very long tails. They tend to have wide rounded wings. That's the result of usually six slotted primaries, so it gives a much rounder look. If you get a good enough view, then the accipiters have pale eyes. Well, yellow, typically yellow to red, unless you see them really quickly out of the nest. It's blue to yellow to red, which is pretty wild. But usually that's something that's a lot easier to see in photos than to actually see in the field. So while it is a useful field mark, it's not, it is a useful identification tool. It's not usually a useful field identification tool. But accipiters have very wide wings, very long tails. They are also chromatically different. For them, it's adults versus young birds. So adults on all three species tend to have very bluish backs. On sharpies and coops, they're reddish underneath, and goshawks are gray with little black fine streaks, whereas young birds tend to be just kind of brownish and white. Even at distance, you still see very wide wings. They have that long tail. From a flight style characteristic, it's often associated with flap glide. It's not to say that other birds don't do that or that's the only thing that they do, but accipiters tend to exhibit that behavior much more frequently than other birds of prey. Still at distance with long wings and long tail, they can start to look like harriers occasionally or falcons, but kind of still those rounded wings, and they're not flying in a dihedral like a harrier would be. And then for goshawks in particular, goshawks give Buteo vibes because they're very large, they have long wings, and they have fairly broad wings, and it makes the tail look a little bit shorter relative to, say, Coopers or Sharpies. However, it's still going to be a much longer tail than Buteo, and they have a kind of a secondary bulge that's not really the same shape as what you find in Buteos. Buteos have long wings, broad wings, and broad wings, ironically enough, relative to some species, actually don't have broad wings. I mean, broad-winged hawks specifically, but I digress. A fairly medium length tail, which is also very wide. At distance, they can be confused with vultures, eagles, accipiters, pretty much everything. Buteos vary so much. There's quite a few species of Buteos. And even with some feather damage, you can still count five slotted primaries on everything except for, as I mentioned before, those three other species. Wide wings, long wings, they, depending on the species, they range highly from flying with what looks like, in some instances, a very steep dihedral. So this short tail, they have just kind of I'm trying to figure out how to do this right, just the tips of the wings up. And so on a curve, that can make it look like a really, really pronounced dihedral. Some things like Swainson's hawks have just a modified dihedral. And then other Buteos fly pretty flat. It's a wide mix of wing shape for Buteos. They're often soaring. They tend to be larger birds. There's also a ton of color variation within Buteos, more than really any of the other groups that we're talking about, which I think is really cool. You get some birds that are almost entirely white, some birds that are almost entirely dark, and in some locations you get some like really reddish birds. It's pretty wild, but they still have the same structures across individual species and similar structures across the genus, of very wide wings, very long wings, kind of a shortish tail but it's a wide tail. And now some birds do have a slightly more pointed wing look. So Swainson's hawk being one of those three species that have 4 slotted primaries, it gives them more of a pointed winged look than you would see in, say, the red tail from the slide before. And another time where you have to be a little careful with angle. The angle of this bird makes it look like it has almost no tail. But even as we start to get further away, there's still very long wings, wide wings. Typically, they're very contrasting between the coverts and the flight feathers, of one being really dark and one being really light. That's kind of a rough generalization. They often will fly in kettles, so you can have mixed kettles with mixed species, mixed ages, and in some instances mixed color variations. So we have kind of all of that going on here. It's both of the species represented here have just 4 marginated primaries, so their wings are a little more pointed than you'd see on, say, like a red tail or a red shoulder. But you can also get some size difference. But even so, both species here have very, very long wings, broad wings, kind of a short, wide tail, which even as you increase distance, those characteristics still hold true. Shifting over to falcons, falcons have kind of moderate to long wings, usually like medium to short tail. If you can see the eye, kind of like with accipiters, if you can see the eye on falcons, it's always dark. But again, that's one of those things that's a lot easier to see in a photo than it is on a bird that's just kind of streaking by you. Even with the wings fanned, they still have a fairly pointed look. Side note, I love it when kestrels get those white-black tail bands. I think it looks really, really sharp. This bird only has really the outer rits are those white-black, but you get some birds with almost the entire tail looks like that. It's pretty amazing. You start to up the distance a little bit, we can still see, kind of stocky birds. Falcons, especially as you get larger than kestrel, falcons are really power and motion. The winds don't really impact them in a big way, and they just kind of cut through whatever they need to cut through to go wherever they need to go. Very, very pointed wings, medium tails, but note the tail's much more rounded than, say, the kites that we were looking at. You can use them for kites, accipiters, sometimes doves, pigeons. Pigeons can have really pointed wings. As an interesting behavioral note, both falcons and kites will often eat on the wing. It's not really behavior that's exhibited by much else, but it's very frequently exhibited by both falcons and kites. And so you can see here, it's ripping off something as heads down at its talons, and often it'll be dragonflies or other insects, but sometimes birds too. And even at weird angles, we still get to that instance where those pointed wings are coming through, their long wings, kind of that medium length tail. It gets tougher as you get farther away, as angle gets a little weirder, but a lot of those traits still come through. We're not really getting color detail, but we are getting very pointed wings, kind of medium to long tail. Switching over to owls. Owls have very long wings as well, very wide wings, tend to be very big headed, but it's a flat head and kind of a medium to short, usually a short tail that's also fairly wide, even in bad light, and because it's often difficult. I mean, short ear, the previous examples, is a fairly easy owl to see relative to the others during the day. But even in bad lights, a lot of these same characteristics are still true. Very large-headed, kind of wide-tailed, long wings. They're often quite rounded wings. Even this bird that's going away, the wings are still fairly rounded. There's a large bulge for the body into the head. And that holds true as well for the smaller owls like saw-whet. Again, large head, wide rounded wings, kind of a short wide tail. And if you can see the legs, all owls will have feathered legs. It's often not something that you can see very clearly, but it is something to note that if you can see it, can be beneficial. And same again, very wide wings, fairly rounded, very obvious, bulky, bulgy head, very wide tail. So just kind of as final thoughts, I showed the silhouette shot earlier, and while you're typically using shape and structure over plumage, it's not to say that plumage is necessarily a negative thing. It just tends to not be as consistent across distance and lighting. And in some instances, plumage makes things substantially easier, whereas shape and structure can be a little more difficult. So all four of these are species that have a very pronounced dihedral. Looking at them at this composite, we can see there's, the bird on the right has much wider wings. It looks like it has a featherless head, so it's probably a safe assumption that that bird's a vulture. And then the others start to get a little bit trickier until you show the colors, and then now they don't even look remotely similar. At distance, though, especially with zone tail on the left and the turkey vulture on the right, they look very similar at distance. So overall, while shape and structure are beneficial, and I would argue as a whole more useful at distance, it's not to completely discount plumage and color details, but just to be mindful of it, to be cautious, and just really just keep looking as much as you can, and just there's always more to learn. And with that, thank you. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them as best as I can.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ted. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A.
Yeah, that helps keep questions in order for us and make sure we don't miss anything. So Ted, when is you just finished off a Hawkwatch recently?
No,
No? Okay, I
not too
didn't
recently.
know if you had one during the spring.
Oh, no, I haven't looked for one in kind of this area yet. It's probably fairly broad front. I mean, I'm not too far from Hawk Ridge, Duluth. It's about a 2-hour
Mhm.
drive, a little over 2 hours. And they do West Skyline count in the spring.
Oh,
It
great.
gets a lot of eagles, a lot of red tails.
Oh, fantastic.
Oh, so we have a question in the chat. Alicia asks, are there any field guides or reference resources you'd recommend to help reinforce these tips?
Oh, tons. both off the top of my head, both the books by Liguori, Hawks from Every Angle and Hawks at a Distance. Those would probably be my top two recommendations. There's Hawks in Flight and version 2, I want to say, that has from Sibley et al.
Yes.
There,
Yeah.
those are probably my top three, especially the two books from Jerry Liguori are just spectacular. Brian Wheeler also has a number of really useful field guides, Raptors of Eastern North America, Western North America.
Great.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're kind of separating out those guides that give useful for identifying hawks at a distance versus field guide pictures.
Yes, and Naresh put into the chat a link to the Hawks from Every Angle.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to find the other ones.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Naresh.
Thanks, Naresh.
There's another question by Yvonne. When red tails and golden eagles are in the same area and circling, I find the size of the circle can distinguish the larger bird from the smaller bird. I don't know if this is due to the mass of the birds or the wing size, but it helps.
So I'd be a little cautious with that, as that'll vary depending on the wind conditions as well, and what the behavior is. If you're talking about breeding grounds versus migration, be a little careful. Oh, one point I did want to mention about birds with dihedrals is anything with a dihedral is always going to end on an up flap. So when they're flapping, they're always going to end on an up flap, whereas something without a dihedral is probably going to end on a down flap.
Oh,
So
interesting.
with bald eagle versus golden eagle, for example, golden eagles will end on the up flap to be into the dihedral, whereas bald eagles will come back to the middle.
That's interesting. Okay.
Interesting. In case you hadn't noticed, Naresh has posted several links in our chat. You might want to grab those links to the books that Ted mentioned. And Ted, you can take down this slide now if you wish.
Oh, okay. Oh, and if you're curious, this is a list of the species and roughly the order in which they showed up in the
Oh,
talk.
cool.
So you want to come back and tell us how to identify them, Ted, next time?
Yeah, I could, sure. That'd probably be a
Uh-huh.
multiple. I don't think I could get through every LA species in a single talk, but sure, if you want me back.
Fantastic.
That'd be great.
I see herring gull. I missed herring gull.
It was with the Osprey.
Yeah.
Mm. Cool.
Yeah, I could imagine going through accipiters, for instance, which are very difficult.
What about vocalizations? I mean, you can oftentimes, red tails or osprey and things like that are pretty obvious, but do you find that useful?
Sure. I mean, it's a lot of it's context. So most of these raptors aren't vocalizing on migration, but if you're just out birding or you're in breeding areas, and some things can be very vocal. Goshawks will take your head off, and usually you'll hear them before they do it, but not always.
Ted, do you know of any SoCal area good hawk watch spots?
There's a spot in San Diego that's probably the best one that's closest.
Okay.
I'm blanking on what the name of that is. Otherwise, you could. It's kind of an interesting thing. I found that if you just kind of stand wherever, you can get a fairly remarkable amount of birds moving. The raptors tend to move in a much broader fronts than we like to think. It's really easy to put it as, oh well, they're flying along this ridge line or along this coast.
Yeah.
I did field surveys in extreme southwestern Minnesota, which has none of those kind of traditional migration barriers, as it were, or benefits, and I still had 16 species of diurnal raptor over the course of the year.
Yeah. Also, it seems like up where you were up near northeast LA County, and maybe certainly northwest LA County would be pretty good hawk watching areas.
And Paiute gets actually pretty good streams of turkey vultures, and things can be mixed in with the turkey vultures. I had decent birds just moving through into Tehachapi when I was in Tehachapi. And if you go over to kind of that Enoch area, I'm sure that there's raptors moving through there as well.
Yeah, and we have a couple of comments coming into our chat. Colin suggests Ramona Grasslands Preserve. I'm not sure what Ramona Grasslands Preserve is.
It's in San Diego.
Oh, okay. Oh, is that the San
Oh, is that
Diego?
the one? Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the one that I was thinking of. I'm blanking on the name of it, though. I apologize.
Okay. Yvonne has another question. Could you compare peregrine and prairie falcons for us?
Sure. They're very difficult to do structurally. Peregrines tend to be a little more like hard lined of line, and prairies are tend to be a little less so. They're a little bulgier. It really is one of those things that you try to look for the axillaries as much as shape and structures is beneficial. Axillaries make such a world of difference on those. The tail shape's a little bit different. The prairies it's a touch longer, but it varies so much. That's a very complicated one.
Yeah.
And Lance points out there certainly were a number of large Swainson's hawk kettles on the south side of the San Gabriels in the foothills in March when there are low clouds, and actually during that time, there were golden eagles and bald eagles and red tails and other stuff going over. So
right.
Maybe not hundreds of thousands of them, but certainly got a number of raptors migrating over in March in the foothills.
So I just want to remind everyone, go into the chat to grab the links before we sign off. And as one of our chatters mentioned, Ted, this was a great learning experience. Thank you very, very much for presenting tonight.
Yep. Thank you so much, and hopefully we'll have you back sometime.
Absolutely. And to continue hawks, don't forget next week we're talking about Swainson's hawks and songbirds. Oh, I think we have another question that popped up, Mark.
Oh, yes, we did. Let's see. In your opinion, are bald or golden eagles more maneuverable?
They both can be as they need to. I guess I would argue for goldens more than bald, but depends on what they're going after. Goldens will go after more bird prey that I've seen, and and when balds go after bird prey, it's more things that are on the water or already injured. It's a very rough generalization.
Interesting.
Okay, great.
Okay. And sorry, that was.
Thank you very much, Ted. That was really informative, and it's one of the ones I think I'll go back and review to see. It reinforced what the little pearls that were sprinkled around in that talk.
Thank you.
And I hope to see everyone, figuratively speaking, of course, I hope to see everyone next week for the Swainson's Hawk Talk. And thank you again, Ted. And we'll see you all next time. Take care, everyone.
Okay, thank you,
Thanks,
Ted.
Ted.
Thank you, Ted.
Bye.
Thanks, Ted.
Goodbye, everyone.